It's really difficult to write about a game when it's one of your top favourites of all time. Not only do you want to convey what makes it so special, but you also want to give people who have never given it a shot a fair description of the mechanics to justify playing it. My first exposure to Street Fighter 3 is actually through an arcade machine in Spain when I was a kid. The appeal of it was fairly lost on me because even though I loved Capcom vs SNK 2 and Marvel vs Capcom 2 for other Capcom fighters, I couldn't really recognise many of the characters in this. And honestly, that's probably why when it launched, it didn't take off for a lot of people in a similar way. There's just so much to dig into with this game, and if you're in any way familiar with fighting games, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. The only way I could compare it is if you didn't know a single thing about art, you were walking through the Louvre and you saw the Mona Lisa on the wall, and it's a tiny, unassuming painting in the corner, and you're like, wow, why is there so many people gathered around that one in particular? And how else could you explain it other than saying the level of reputation and execution just speaks for itself? So I did just try and compare Third Strike as the Mona Lisa of games, but I will try and justify why I think that's the case. We're going to get to later on why the game is so technically impressive for what it does, but anyone who's seen footage of that Daigo moment at EVO is going to know exactly what I'm talking about. So we're going to be talking about Third Strike in particular, which is the third balanced iteration of the Street Fighter 3 series. It was a pretty common practice for Capcom in the 90s before patching games was the thing to release an update for arcades as a completely new and repackaged version of a game every couple of years. Before Third Strike, the original version of Street Fighter 3 was called New Generation, and the patch after that was called Second Impact. So, goes without saying, Third Strike was the third balance update for Street Fighter 3 and gave us 5 new characters, including mainstay Chun-Li from Street Fighter 2. On top of the character additions, all the existing cast were given new stages, endings and voice actors. The new stages and the endings in particular are also a continuation of events of what happened from where the first two Street Fighter 3 games left off. In general, the Street Fighter 3 games were seen as an attempt to try and reinvent the formula after the multiple versions of Street Fighter 2 that had already been out for consoles and arcades. The first version of Street Fighter 3 was released in 1997, but the Street Fighter Alpha series was still ongoing with a release in 1998. Street Fighter 3 altogether is just a totally different beast to the Alpha and the 2 series before it. It features almost an entirely new cast with wrestler Alex, who according to the devs is based off of Hulk Hogan starring as the main character. He fights an organisation called the Illuminati as the central focus of the game, and the previous story of Ryu against M. Bison and Shadaloo is completely out the window. Driving all this was a completely new graphics board made by Capcom called a CPS-3 engine, dedicated especially to more detailed sprite work than they'd ever done before. Other than the recent Arc System Works games like BlazBlue and Guilty Gear, I haven't seen a company try and do as detailed sprite work as this in the last 20 years. Capcom made that CPS-3 board as an upgrade to the CPS-2 board they had already been using for Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Alpha and the Darkstalkers fighting games of the last couple of years before this. Unfortunately, because it was fairly costly to use this board, they only wound up developing a handful of games off it. They made this like He-Man, Thundercats type fighting game called Red Earth on it. That's pretty cool if you've never heard of that before, worth checking out. Then they obviously made the Street Fighter 3 game and the 2 upgrades along with that. And a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure fighting game, which is pretty cool too.
Very nice, Shiza-chan!
The new engine allowed for more elaborate 2D sprites than any other fighting games that have been made before it. All CPS-3 games run at 60 frames a second, with each character having between 700 to 1200 individual frames of animation. Unfortunately, the 3 series didn't set the arcades on fire the same way Street Fighter 2 did on release like Capcom expected it would. Seems just like everyone else, when I was a kid in that Spanish arcade, I wasn't interested in giving any of the new characters a chance. The almost entirely new cast just had me instantly uninterested, and I just wanted to pick Vega or Honda instead. Little did I know, I should have just given the new cast a chance, just like I did the first time on the Super Nintendo when I was like 12 years old. All of the characters are just insanely well animated and full of life in everything they do. I've never had a fighting game like that before where it's genuinely just fun to explore the movesets for the characters because of the way that they respond to their button presses and the special moves as well. I can't stress enough, for all 3 versions of Street Fighter 3, the fluidity and expressiveness of every character is nothing like I've seen in any other game. And I think the quality of the animation has still stood the test of time right to this day. In general, I think game feel is something that's incredibly difficult to quantify in words. The footage we captured might justify it a little bit, but picking up Third Strike for anyone should feel very smooth in a way that you haven't experienced before playing a fighting game. There's not much more I can say than, trust me, you should just give it a shot. Street Fighter 3 tried to give players a chance to dig a bit deeper than the systems that they had for attacking and defending that was in Street Fighter 2. The most famous of these being the parry system, where instead of holding back to block like you traditionally would, You can push forward just before the enemy hits you and it will give you a bigger window to punish the attack that they've just done. This made the overall metagame get pretty complicated, and it got to the point that tournaments of Street Fighter 3 were these insane games of cat and mouse, where half the shots the tournament players were taking at each other during matches were being deflected using the parry system. There's plenty of really good YouTube channels still on the go that would archive a lot of that tournament footage from the early 2000s. The Shend is a really good one in particular that we'll link in the description. It was only when I delved more into the game over the years that I realised the difficulty of getting that execution of the deeper systems of the game perfect, and how much practice you'd actually need to deflect every attack frame in that Daigo parry I'd seen in that Evo tournament footage all those years ago. That parry itself is actually featured as a challenge in the PS3 version of Third Strike, and yeah, it's even harder than it looks. In particular, I think the music in Third Strike is something that always has me going back to it for a certain atmosphere that isn't in many other games. It almost feels like there's an anime influence from stuff like Cowboy Bebop and then taken on by later series like Samurai Champloo, where they're taking a more unconventional jazz and hip hop cue of how to score its music. Third Strike has a really varied mix of jazz, electronic and drum and bass music for its soundtrack that makes it stand out a ton from any other fighting game in the market.
What's the crack here on here? Yeah, Carl's not messing, that tune is amazing, so I'm gonna stick it in here over the intro footage and hope that we don't get a copyright claim. Enjoy.
You know you get finished. Round one, round two, just come and get with it. Your heart ain't cold stone, forget about the power. Battle this out to the 24th hour. Paying the price that you couldn't deal with. Cold-blooded killers in my lockdown clique. Got no time to waste, we taking time bombs. Street Fighter 3 like a star. Get my arm, take your first move. So what's it gonna be? You're trapped in a new world of Street Fighter 3. The third chapter, so what's it gonna be? You're trapped in a new world of Street Fighter 3. Make your first move. So what's it gonna be? You're trapped in a new world of Street Fighter 3. The third chapter, so what's it gonna be?
I just think as a complete package there's nothing like it overall in terms of atmosphere and satisfaction of how good it feels to play. And it still has me coming back to it as my favourite fighting game over and over again years later. Overall it seems like from the depth of the systems and the completely new cast of characters, it might have taken away from the average person trying to pick the game up when it was released. The reception to Street Fighter 3 was so underwhelming at the time that Yoshinori Ono, who works as the producer for Street Fighter 4 and 5, was a sound producer on Street Fighter 3, he had to literally beg Capcom for them to make another entry in the series. Seems like a long time away now, but it was actually a miracle that Street Fighter 4 was even greenlit and made. I still remember the shock of seeing when 4 was announced, because re-releases and remasters of 2 was considered all the Street Fighter the general public was going to be getting. 4 had a massive impact as leading this new wave of fighting games that were part of the billion-dollar esports industry that's going today. And with fighting games being my favourite genre, I'm delighted that they got a second shot in the spotlight with the general public. Can be a bit of a risky trade-off in some ways though. The increasing lack of effort that you need to put in order to have a reward for your attacks in Street Fighter 5, it gives a wider audience but at the sacrifice of a higher skill ceiling. There's plenty of interesting discussion about that on YouTube if you want to look into that further. We have a Core A Gaming video we can link in the description about this that's very good at summarising some of the points. Nowadays, thanks to esports and more people than ever having their eyes on Street Fighter, I feel like that Street Fighter 3 is having a little bit of a resurgence as a cult classic, which is great. It's definitely more recognised as well, with more of the 3 characters now making it into Street Fighter 5 in the DLC. If you're into fighting games in general, I couldn't recommend enough picking up the Street Fighter collection that's on the current gen consoles and giving Third Strike a shot. It hasn't aged a day, and it definitely does not get enough appreciation. Thanks for watching. If you like what we're doing, be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll have more videos up on the way soon. Cheers!